Swamp Thing Anatomy Explored. Created by writer Len Wein and artist Bernie Brightson in 1971, Swamp Thing was supposed to be the main dude of a one-shot horror comic, but then he became a hit amongst readers and the rest is history. Dr. Alec Holland had always felt a connection with the flora around him and was drawn to studying them. He had already created a number of plant-based chemicals that were intended to help humanity. While working on a biorestorative formula that could regrow dead plants, he was attacked by people who wanted to steal the formula. The explosion left him for dead in a nearby swamp, and the formula spilt around him. This led to the creation of Swamp Thing, but there's a lot more to his anatomy and physiology than meets the eye. Swamp Thing is a hell of a lot more than just a plant-themed superhero. So in this video, we'll explore everything from his genetic makeup to what happens when someone eats him. Let's begin, shall we? And before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. So thank you. Let's begin. What does Swamp Thing's physical body look like? At the end of the 20th issue of the new saga of the Swamp Thing, the eponymous character is captured by the men of somebody named General Sunderland. These guys riddle the Swamp Thing with bullets and he seemingly dies. Sunderland then puts the green monster into cryosleep before seeking the help of one Jason Woodrue, or the Floronic Man, another DC villain who hails from an interdimensional world that houses human-like beings called the Dryads. Woodrue's world was based on plants, so he became somewhat of a botanical expert. In the 21st issue of the comic, Woodrue is called in by Sunderland so that he can study Swamp Thing's physiology and extract that formula that Swamp Thing was working on during his human life. Woodrue opens up the swampy creature and the things he finds inside are shocking to say the least. Woodrue found a lung-like organ, except that the lungs were not functional, merely a replica of human lungs made out of vegetable fiber. Now, human lungs have tiny capillary tubes that let oxygen pass through into the blood, but the Swamp Thing's faux lungs, made of these vegetable fibers, were too coarse to allow oxygen molecules to pass on through. Essentially, these lungs only sucked and blew instead of absorbing oxygen from the air and passing it into the rest of the body as human lungs would. And then there was the sponge-like vegetable brain inside a leathery skull, the replicated heart, and the kidneys. So what was the deal with all these fake organs inside the humanoid made out of lichens and leaves? Why were they present inside him when they had no biological need or ability to function? Woodrue spent the next few days studying the Swamp Thing, but none of his theories could unravel the secrets that his employer desired to learn. But the fog lifts when Woodrue reads something by mistake, and this leads to an epiphany. A few years back, a group of scientists were conducting experiments using a planarian worm. They taught this worm to run a simple maze, effectively educating it. Later, they dissect this planarian worm and fed it to its brethren who had not been taught to run the maze. However, after these worms had digested their brother, they somehow gained the knowledge and skills required to run the maze. Woodrue theorized that intelligence could sometimes be transferred through the digestive tract. Alec Holland was working on the biorestorative formula when the explosion occurred. The combined effect of the blast and the reflex muscles in Alec Holland's body propelled him through the door and into the swamp, but Alec Holland was long dead. His corpse and the biorestorative formula went into the swamp, where the corpse decomposed and the formula spread around him in the water. This patch of swamp was teeming with microorganisms and other plant life, and they mutated because of the formula, leading the plant systems to ingest the mortal remains of Alec Holland. The plants ate him just like the planarian worms eating their educated brother, and by some strange miracle, these plants became infected by a powerful consciousness that did not realize it was no longer alive. That cloudy and confused intelligence still had vague notions of what it was like to be human, and gradually it shaped the plant cells into a physiology it was more comfortable and familiar with. This consciousness remembered having bones, so it built itself a skeleton of wood and muscles of plant fiber. This would also explain the redundant lungs, heart and kidneys. To sum it up, Alec Holland was not the Swamp Thing, and the green monster was just intelligent plant life that thought it was Alec Holland. It was a plant that was trying its level best to be a human named Alec Holland. Later, Swamp Thing is thawed by Woodrue, and after learning the truth about its existence, the Swamp Thing kills Sunderland before accepting its reality. Which internal body parts does Swamp Thing have? Written by Matthew Manning and S.D. Perry, the novel titled DC Comics Anatomy of a Metahuman has a chapter on Swamp Thing's anatomy. Here, the writers explain how they see the elemental forces that govern the world and how these forces lead to the formation of the Swamp Thing. Many beings can actually sense when the balance of nature is out of harmony. There are three kinds of elemental forces. The first one is the red, a force that pervades and connects animal life. The second is called the rot, or the black, which is the force of death, decomposition and destruction, and it's the force that all living beings fight to keep in check. However, the final one is completely opposite to the rot. Called the green, it's the force that is connected with life, growth and regeneration. When the green chooses an avatar, they are turned into the living, thinking personification of botanical growth and the champion of its interests. When Alec Holland became the Swamp Thing, he obviously developed a psionic ability in addition to chlorokinetic and telepathic abilities. However, his physiology is of particular interest. The green chose him to serve as its protector and by extension as the protector of all life, human, animal and plant. Swamp Thing's abilities are rooted in his control over living green plants and his ability to exercise human restraint, seeking to achieve balance for the green instead of domination. So essentially, his DNA is a combination of plant and human DNA. He is physically a humanoid, since we can clearly see the silhouette of a man behind the thick, deep green flesh. Additionally, the Swamp Thing also has limbs, a torso and a face from which branches and leaves keep sprouting. Heavy bark-like armor has formed across his body and is overtaken by more layers of green, including vines, grasses, saplings and flowers. As a physical embodiment of the green, Alec Holland doesn't have a human core, and his malleable body can take any form apart from holding the ability to reform himself from any plant life. His own cells were somehow physically replaced as plant stem cells, and the plant cells were incapable of creating a working facsimile of specific animal cells. In conclusion, the organic matter that makes up Swamp Thing's body is composed of countless microscopic organisms, including bacteria, fungi and algae. These organisms work together to create a highly adaptable and resilient organism that is able to survive in almost any environment. Can Swamp Thing talk to plants? Well, the Swamp Thing can control all plant life in the environment. He can command the tiniest algae molecule and acres of jungles and forests. Facilitated with the power of the green, Swamp Thing can practically force a plant to grow at an incredibly fast rate, which enables it to create an army of needles, thorns, branches and vines. Furthermore, trees burst from his very chest, and the vines quickly entangle his unfortunate enemies. A similar power is displayed by Poison Ivy, but her control over plants is far less potent, at least when compared to Swamp Thing. But how is this lightning-fast chlorokinesis possible? Well, he communicates with plants and orders them to do what he wants, but there's still a hiccup there. Just because he can communicate with them and ask them to grow doesn't necessarily mean the plants would suddenly get enough nutrients and the right physical conditions to grow, right? I mean, Swamp Thing can't alter the chemical composition of the soil or the climate of the region. Realistically, Swamp Thing builds a physical link with the plants that he controls and possibly shares his stem cells to help them transform into a semi-connected appendage by some kind of pollination. In other words, he probably gives a bit of the green to the plants he wants to then grow. He could be shedding thousands and thousands of organic matter molecules that pollinate the plants in his vicinity. Can Swamp Thing control alien plants? Before I answer this question, it's important to note that one of the coolest powers of the Swamp Thing is his ability to create an astral projection of himself and abandon his physical body to travel to far away places. In one of the comics, Swamp Thing was seemingly killed, so much so that Commissioner Gordon gives a eulogy and the Batman attends the funeral as a representative of the superhero community. However, Swamp Thing was not dead. Although his body was burned, his frequency or his astral projection travelled to a planet bathed entirely in the colour blue. He could not access the green, and it was just this blue planet that could accommodate Swamp Thing's new frequency. Here, he achieved several noteworthy feats. Because he was feeling extremely lonely, he created a clone of himself using the alien plant life, but the clone turned out to be extremely boring. I mean, they had like 5 stalemates in chess. So Swamp Thing allowed the clone to die. Later, he recreated his wife, and although she looked more or less like her, she didn't have his wife's original smile or consciousness, but that didn't stop Swamp Thing from making out with her. Later, he created the entire population of the Louisiana town of Huma, but by the end of the comic, he was tearing down his own creation. So yes, Swamp Thing can, in fact, control alien plant life as well, which brings us to our next entry. Can Swamp Thing make a human body? So yes, he can control alien flora and create clones and other humans, but these people aren't really humans, are they? They are essentially refurbished plant matter made to look like humans and even have some human-like attributes. But the Swamp Thing fails to create perfect replicas, let alone give them a conscience, personality, etc. He can only create the physical embodiment and nothing more. This was quite what happened when he tried to replicate his wife on the strange blue planet. The clone looked like Swamp Thing's wife and even felt like her, but she had this weird smile and an empty personality that Swamp Thing couldn't bear to stand. Can Swamp Thing reproduce? In the 5th issue of Swamp Thing New Roots, our green leafy superhero is confronted with a shocking truth, something that has the potential to change the course of his life. It turns out that Sunderland Corporation was planning to mass produce Swamp Thing's children so that they could be globally used as forced and free labor. When Swamp Thing learned about this horrifying reality, he stormed a press meet housed by Sunderland Corporation in which his children were to be showcased. During the skirmish, one of his children dies, and he holds his dying progeny in his arms. But Swamp Thing wasn't there to fight. He engages with the reporters and the crowd as the cameras roll and tells them that he wants no part in killing anyone. Instead, Swamp Thing offers to help humanity to rebuild their world into a sustainable place where humans could live a genuinely better life. But in order for that to happen, humans must first make a conscious choice between staying on the path of destruction and death and building a future in which everyone can live in harmony. Basically, he was suggesting that with the help of his children, Earth could become a place where nature and society live in a symbiotic relationship instead of a parasitic one. It's worth noting that this new and overtly unexpected fatherhood of the elemental superhero comes to shape the way he sees humans and their activities. Now that he has a baby, the conflict between nature and man will affect not only him, but also his children. And although this continuity goes on to show that Swamp Thing wants humans to choose their own path and make their own decisions, the other volumes, such as the Saga of Swamp Thing, are proof that he doesn't really have the patience. What happens when you eat the Swamp Thing? In the 34th issue of the Swamp Thing comic, written by Alan Moore in 1985, Abby and the Swamp Thing are sitting by a stream. Abby's current husband is in a coma, and the doctors have told her to move on, but clearly she feels disturbed about what the future holds for her and what she should do next as far as her own love life is concerned. Swamp Thing tells her that it's pointless to torture oneself and suggests that not only should she move on, but she should also confide her feelings to the person that she loves. Abby takes this opportunity to tell Swamp Thing that she, in fact, loves him. Swamp Thing unfortunately doesn't reciprocate her feelings initially and remains silent, but later he admits that he has loved her for a number of years. Swamp Thing and Abby share a passionate kiss, and Abby tells him that he tastes like lime. Not so sharp, but lime nonetheless. When Swamp Thing asks her if she likes lime, she says yes. So does that mean that Swamp Thing actually knows what people feel and how they think? Because of course, tasting like lime and nothing else would be quite a strange coincidence, right? Nevertheless, Swamp Thing also knows that Abby would need more than kisses and the taste of lime from the person that she loves. Abby is quick to understand that he's talking about making love, and she tells him that she can live without the act. Swamp Thing knows that such assurances would prove to be futile in the long run, but how can the two of them make love? I mean, Swamp Thing isn't even an animal for beginners. He's essentially a plant. Swamp Thing is unable to engage in animal activity, and so instead he offers Abby a tuber that grows from his body as a means of achieving a form of communication between them. But Abby is reluctant, which would be quite natural. We know all about eating out our partners. Doing it literally though, I suppose it's a form of cannibalism, right? Maybe it's different if your partner is a tree. And speaking of which, did you know that in a few customs, like the Hindu religion for example, brides marry a tree as a representation of their commitment to staying rooted in their cultural and spiritual values. Look, anyway, despite her initial reluctance, Abby takes a bite from this tuber and she's soon swept away into a hallucinogenic experience. During the trip, she perceives the world as Swamp Thing does, feeling a deep connection to the green and the profound sense of unity between all things. She is enthralled by seeing the world as Swamp Thing does, and it was this experience that ultimately forged the unbreakable bond between the two. However, this wasn't something that Swamp Thing did specifically for Abby. In reality, the tuber and its hallucinations or illusions could be considered one of Swamp Thing's many powers, but not everyone experiences the same illusions. The nature of the illusions depends on the morality and personality of the individual who eats the tuber. Good and honest individuals, like Abby, will have relaxing and pleasant experiences, while evil and malicious individuals will be subjected to painful and terrifying experiences. I suppose it adds a whole new dimension to the phrase food for thought. Is Swamp Thing immortal? To better understand if Swamp Thing is an immortal being or not, it's essential to understand his physiology and the nature of his person. It was John Constantine who first told Swamp Thing about his elemental nature and asked him to reconstitute his body. Although Swamp Thing was active before these events, he wasn't fully aware of his capabilities. As an elemental, Swamp Thing basically houses a consciousness inside a human body, but he can abandon his physical form to house this consciousness in another shell, and he can grow himself again from practically any plant life, no matter how simple or small. So, even if his physical self is destroyed by pollution or fire or anything else, he can regenerate with little to no effort. This was recently confirmed in the 28th issue of Justice League Dark, in which he's destroyed, but one of his colleagues finds signs of life in whatever remained of Swamp Thing. But as I mentioned in the first entry, Swamp Thing was able to come back to life from what seemed like death. Later in the 76th and 77th issues of that same comic, titled The Return of the Good Gumbo, Swamp Thing is reborn with a slightly different appearance and a whole new set of powers. In The Death of Swamp Thing, which was released in 1996, Swamp Thing is seemingly killed for good by General Sunderland, but his consciousness is able to survive in the form of a new Swamp Thing, who is later revealed to be a combination of Alec Holland and the Swamp Thing entity. And in yet another story arc, he survives by merging his consciousness with that of his former lover, Abigail Arcane. So you see, Swampy is more or less immortal. Essentially, as long as there is some form of plant life anywhere in the universe, he'll always have a vessel through which to house his consciousness, effectively rendering him immortal. Quite clearly, Swamp Thing is a hell of a lot more than just a plant-themed superhero. He is an elemental who can't really be killed, and someone who has fought alongside the likes of Superman, Batman, and the entire Justice League. If you have any further questions about Swamp Thing, feel free to pop them into the comments, or any other questions or suggestions you have in general. Like, what did you think about Man-Thing, which was Marvel's version of Swamp Thing? And of course, if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.